Hello, my name is Doug Peckinpah, and I'm a publisher at BNP Media, overseeing a variety of business-to-business publications like beverage industry, dairy foods, the national provisioner, snack food and wholesale bakery, and packaging strategies. I'll be our moderator for today's webinar. BNP Media has a long history of working with FPSA. I'm also a member of the Packaging Network, and I'm excited to dig into the subject of navigating EPR, turning packaging compliance into a competitive advantage today. With 7 state laws now in place, extended producer responsibility for packaging is no longer optional, especially for food and beverages. Today's session will help you understand the legislation, compliance steps, and how to turn this challenge into a market advantage. We will try and be as conversational as we can today with a relaxed approach toward this webinar. I would encourage you to submit questions throughout the process, and at the end, we will address as many questions as we have time for. So let's get started by getting to know our panelists and their perspectives on the industry. Let's begin with Dan. Dan Felden, would you mind introducing yourself and your role at the Flexible Packaging Association?
Yeah, thank you, Doug. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today and continue the partnership FPA has with BNP Media. I'm Dan Felton, President and CEO of the Flexible Packaging Association, also known as FPA, and we represent packaging converters, manufacturers, and suppliers within the flexible packaging industry throughout the United States. In terms of what I'm excited about to have this conversation is today is another opportunity to bring stakeholders across the packaging value chain together to discuss and strategize on a very complicated emerging public policy issue in the U.S., that being extended producer responsibility. The more people we can have talking about these state laws and their implementations and how they're impacting the industry, in my view, the better. Thanks, Doug.
Thank you, Dan. And we're also joined today by Ethan Redden from BSI. Ethan, could you please say a few words about yourself and your role in this industry?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Ethan Redden from BSI, or British Standards Institute. Basically, I'm the lead circularity and carbon reduction consultant here on our sustainability team. And we assist with extended producer responsibility on a myriad of different industries, as well as specifically in the food and beverage packaging on the manufacturing side, as well as the consumer side. So what I'm excited about today is, given that I'm based in Colorado with our head office in New Jersey, I specifically, the conversations about EPR go all over the place, getting people's understandings and understanding that, I guess, what is currently being discussed is always sometimes different, or most of the time different, than the cutting edge newest information. Since updates on EPR are so vast and frequent, I'm curious to see where everyone's stance is at current moment and feelings on the newer states being added, as well as the other aspects that make it quite unique and complicated as we move into next year's reporting as well.
Great. Thank you, Ethan. Welcome. So now we know who's with us. Let's set the stage by taking a current look at the legislative landscape, which seems to change, it seems like every week. Dan, can you start us off with look at the big picture? What do companies need to know about these 7 state laws and where things are headed?
Yeah, thanks, Doug. And Ethan, I appreciate that you're based in Colorado, obviously being one of the states that is moving forward with their packaging EPR law, and then company headquartered in New Jersey, with maybe coming to a state near you soon, right? So, Doug, I'm just going to maybe spend about 90 seconds giving a real quick snapshot of sort of the 7 state laws. This is difficult to do. We could spend hours talking about the differences between the laws, and then I'll pause. I know we have some other questions teed up. But let me just give that quick overview. Is again, we have 7 state laws in place, and those are, I'm going to list them in order that they will go into effect, not when they were enacted, but we have Oregon first up, actually went into effect in July of this year. Colorado will be essentially in full effect in January of 2026. Then we have Maine, which goes into effect early 2027. California is targeting to go into effect in July of 2027. Maryland Maryland likely a year later in July 2028. Minnesota targeted right now to go into effect in January 2029. And the last state to most recently be enacted this year is Washington State, and that program appears that it will go into effect in 2030. All of these cover packaging, all packaging, so we're not just talking about plastic, but paper, aluminum, glass, metals, combinations of all those. Some of them also include printed paper products as well. The key thing I want to point out is making sure that people within the industry, particularly brand owners, producers, if you will, need to be registered. And registration has already started and the dates have passed in some other states, including in Oregon, in Colorado, California registration, and then other states will require registration over 2026. 2027, but it's important for producers to be registered with Circular Action Alliance. That is CAA, the Producer Responsibility Organization. I'm happy to cover off and provide a grid afterwards of other sort of general requirements in terms of when producers have to start reporting data to Circular Action Alliance, when payments will begin having to be received from the producers to CAA, and then when funds will start to go out. But Doug, I'm going to pause there. I know I could certainly cover off on some other things. Ethan may have some things to add, about the challenges on state versus federal and who pays into the system. But let me pause there and let you take it for a moment if you want me to clarify anything.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Dan, for setting the stage. And I think it's a good idea to pass things off to Ethan here. Ethan, what are you seeing inside companies as they're trying to keep up with this kind of flurry of legislation?
Well, usually what we're saying is like three major impacts. The complexity of reporting requirements definitely stumps most people. The food and beverage companies that we work with, they're facing mostly confusion about the differences between each state. Like Dan said, each state is very different, and we can be here for days at a time talking about the minute differences between each one. But with the complexity around it, usually making adjustments to their, I guess, data collection around the packaging schemes around their products seems to be the most complex part of that. Essentially taking what limited data they have and exploring ways to gather more data, but also answer the report with the data that they currently have, making assumptions where they need to, where they don't have specific data. And also disruption to operations and supply chains with customer requests. We've gotten a lot of those. Sometimes we're working with clients who need to request data from other organizations or the other way around. That kind of navigation of conversation becomes quite complex and a focus for our clients, and as well as just cost pressures and early lessons. The biggest thing here is usually the first contact we have with the client is someone handing off EPR responsibilities to them, and they have no clue what they're supposed to do when they come to us. So getting an understanding of the true cost of compliance, not just the fees, but the staff time and system changes that are required, are usually the three most major impacts that we're seeing.
When we look at the compliance challenges, when we're looking at the food and beverage industry, I think there's some pretty unique challenges. Ethan, can you talk a little bit about what makes compliance so uniquely challenging in food packaging compared to other industries that are dealing with EPR legislation?
Yeah, for sure. I think the biggest challenge that we've seen is the multi-material and food contact packaging. Since there's multiple materials made into this packaging, makes it kind of complex to actually put it into a category. Unlike other industries, the food and beverage packaging often combines like plastic films and laminates and coatings. So since these are difficult to separate, and food safety regulations also limit material substitutions, this makes the conversation a little bit more nuanced compared to other industries. Outside of the cardboard boxes, I think those are pretty simple for everyone to mostly understand. It is a good place to start as well to get a base understanding. I think another aspect would be infrastructure limitations. So recycling systems in the US aren't uniformly equipped to handle complex food packaging formats. So understanding and gaining some recyclable initiatives for the companies are sometimes hard, especially since some aspects of food packaging aren't recyclable in this state, but are recyclable in that state as of now. And as that will change in the future, I'm sure it'll get easier, but as of right now, it's a little bit complex for this industry in specific formats.
Yeah, the level of different materials and the different nuances from state to state, can be kind of baffling. Dan, how are policymakers responding to some of the complexity here and some of the practical realities that are out in the industry today?
Yeah, thanks, Doug. And I think as Ethan highlighted, there's challenges both on the material side and how packaging materials and formats are being combined, and then on the recovery side as well. And one thing we've seen from policymakers is there's definitely a very high level of education, right? Is that when they're putting legislative proposals forward and sort of wanting to treat all materials the same, we know that you can't do that, but there's a real education level, both as legislation is being considered, and then if it's signed into law, then how that legislation is regulated and implemented. And policymakers, again, once we start educating them, we're seeing there is some openness to sort of shaping the laws and regulations to take into consideration some of those special things, either about the materials and the formats or the recovery methods. And that there's been some progress. The last three laws enacted, we have seen them be, I think most people agree, are a little bit more producer friendly in terms of not, establishing really strong requirements in statute. I mean, I think we all want, obviously want less waste. We want more recycled content, encouraging, packaging to evolve, but also for the recovery system to evolve. And we've seen that some encouraging signals in the last three laws enacted. But, then we have the regulatory process and really seeing this gap on the legislative intent and then that being executed or implemented. And we see that with the legislative or the regulatory proposals that are coming forward. And it's daily. I think we've got 2 comment periods open this week. We're working at FPA to submit comments, but just trying to, find where we can shape things through the regulatory process and/or conceivably go back and tell policymakers, hey, we need to fix this law. And we saw that happen in Maine this year. Maine was first out of the gate, first enacted in the country. Oregon back in 2021 followed 3 weeks later. But as that program in Maine is being implemented, they've seen what's happened in other states, right? And it was encouraging this year to see Maine legislators recognize that and the governor to sign a law into place to fix some things. First out isn't always first best, right? And it was encouraging that as we continue the dialogue with policymakers, they're open to all of us discovering this sort of new regime, if you will, on packaging and recycling in the U.S. and working together to try to shape best possible outcomes. I'm so encouraged by that. Also happy if we have time to want to discuss some of these laws are being challenged already. Oregon will probably see a challenge in Colorado. So, when things can't be addressed through the legislative regulatory process, sometimes they get handled in court.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a process to say the least. And I think as each state brings its EPR legislation to the table, they are looking at some of the successes and some of the challenges that the other states have been facing. Nevertheless, we have some deadlines ahead of us. There's certain milestones that we have to hit. Dan, what are the key milestones and deadlines that companies should be tracking and paying attention to these days?
Yeah, I think, and I'm sure Ethan can speak to this as well, is first and foremost, if are a producer, a brand owner for covered materials in any given state, or you think you might be, you need to be working with Circular Action Alliance now. It still shocks me when I'm at meetings and a lot more people thankfully know a lot more about EPR, Doug, than they did 2 or 3 years ago. But definitely people don't realize they need to be registered. So, make sure you're registered, getting information from Circular Action Alliance, really key, and then know those dates. When the money needs to start flowing, and when your company is, if you've got covered materials, may be obligated to start sending funds to Circular Action Alliance. And again, FPA can provide additional information, as I'm sure Ethan can too, about those target dates. And then I think, just be aware as the programs continue to get implemented. I'm always a big fan of people within the industry participating in the process. So if there's rulemaking and you and your company are super interested in influencing that process, work with your trade associations, and your local elected officials to try to shape those. Work with Circular Action Alliance as they roll out the program plans in each state. It's not one national program plan. They have to, by law, do a program plan in each state. We can talk, maybe we get to a national program another day, but those are sort of the key things I think about, to be prepared and be prepared early. Otherwise you're going to be reporting the wrong materials. You may be paying fees that are higher or different than you should be paying. So again, that's sort of in a nutshell what I think companies should be thinking about.
Yeah, it's a lot for companies to kind of wrap their minds around. While this has been building for the last few years, it's really starting to get very actionable just lately. And Ethan, I was wondering if you could provide some perspective, for a company that's just starting to consider, what the implications of EPR, where should they start? What's their roadmap?
Essentially, echoing what Dan said, engaging with the CAA is very important. The most easiest thing you could do is sign up for their email list so you can get updates to your email. That helps with reducing surprises. Oftentimes, I forget about that as we've already been so engaged with EPR, but it is a great first step. The second step I would suggest is assigning accountability, not just necessarily handing it over to someone and saying, here, EPR stuff, you go figure it out, but more or less giving it to someone that's at least somewhat interested in it or has the capacity to engage in it. It does take a good amount of work. There's usually some data infrastructure that has to be rebuilt at some scale. So giving it to someone and assigning responsibility to one or more people to have the capacity to take this on would be a good second step. And then therefore, after that, they probably would initiate that infrastructure changes based off the data you already have and the sales data and the packaging data you've already understood, as well as like auditing the current packaging portfolio. If you've submitted data before to the CAA, we're a little past a couple of months after since reports are due. So some of you might have already submitted reports. That if you don't already have someone assigned accountability or a team, then the next step they would need to do is assign kind of review what you've already had done and go from there. So I would say those are the good bundle of first steps that any organization should take, no matter where they are on the journey.
Ethan, can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah.
So I'm curious from your perspective, assisting companies with, compliance and implementation is, at my previous job at Ameripen, I was much more closely connected with the brands, but I saw a really interesting dialogue developing within companies is how do they tackle this? And it's really cross-functional when you think about procurement and packaging design and engineering, legal, compliance.
Yeah.
And all that, and whether a company can tackle all that internally with their existing resources and human, let's just say headcount, or do they build a system internally, or do they do a combination of that and bringing cross-functional teams together using consultants like BSI? I think, I remember some smaller companies have come to me and said, I can't possibly, I'm already doing 2 or 3 jobs, right? How am I going to handle this? And I'm just curious what you've seen from the companies you're working with in terms of how they're sort of cracking that nut, I guess,
Yeah, for sure. I think trying to just gloss over as many of the clients that we see, the typical structure that we get is someone's handed the information. It's like you deal with the EPR stuff. They're usually a procurement person or a compliance employee focusing on just general sustainability or just sales data in that regard. The next step is usually them going and running and grabbing their data guy, is how they usually word it. So in the terms of building capacity and such, these people usually are quite busy. These employees focus on other tasks. So as we guide them through, and probably multiple consultants guide them through, is building that structure of that communication team of like who you need information from, what teams you need information from, and who needs to give you that information, who basically gives the sales data, who is the person on the ground that understands how the packaging actually applies. There's certain times where some packaging is lost, so accounting for packaging lost and not sold into units. There's usually the legal team somehow gets involved on their own, as someone's like, do we really have to do this or really have to pay for these things? And then the legal team is usually brought in. So there's usually like 5 to 6 different departments that are eventually brought in. And our role usually in that case is to manage over how that builds up that system. Basically, there's some aspects of even EINs and understanding the tax IDs. If a company has subsidiaries, and that kind of works differently. So that's where it comes into play, these different aspects. So kind of setting a standard, to answer your question bluntly, of what we usually do is helps, I guess, initiate who needs to get what data and what time. That way it minimizes their confusion as well as streamlines the entire process. And that's why it's not just on one person to figure out something that they never even thought of before, which is what is the EIN number of our company, for example.
Yeah, the data component is fascinating to me because I mean I think of when you look at California and the source reduction requirements in California, and producers need their source reduced, and there's that crazy formula how to do that. You can get there different ways, but the 25% source reduction, but I think by 2032. But there's that look back period, and when companies start to look back and say, well, I don't even know if I have the data to be able to say, well, this is the source reduction I was doing this year, this year, this year. So it's interesting. Just people, companies will get in they'll settle in eventually and know what they need to do year over year. But it can be frustrating, I'm sure, for companies right now where they weren't thinking I need to be tracking this, or I should be capturing that data. So
Exactly.
You know, as we as we've seen with other broad-based kind of industry initiatives, as this is being implemented and as the industry is assimilating where we are and where we need to go, we have been developing our own lexicon around EPR. Ethan, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about one of the buzzwords that we've been hearing, eco-modulation. Can you break down what this means and how companies can use it to their advantage?
Yeah, usually we don't even bring up eco-modulation at the start because there's so much to go over, but it is a complex and interesting aspect that I'm always excited about getting to once we actually get to it. To put it simply, eco-modulation is essentially like a system of initiatives and penalties and fee structures. So you can think of it as like companies pay higher fees for packaging that is hard to recycle or has a higher environmental impacts, and lower fees for packaging that is recyclable, reusable, or made from recycled content. So like why it matters is mostly on that it turns like compliance from like a burden into somewhat of an opportunity. This can cross with other sustainability initiatives as well. So keep that in mind. But by, I guess, redesigning packaging with eco-modulation in mind, you can cut future compliance costs. But also with the FDA regulations and food contact aspects, this can be quite hard for this industry. So the case in point, I would say, is we've seen companies save money and improve on the sustainability story by shifting their mindset to recyclable formats. This helps, again, with greenhouse gas as well, emissions, but mainly it can help with EPR and the eco-modulation aspect, aligning with consumer expectations while reducing long-term feast exposure. So in some aspects, Tetra Pak is a good option if it's recyclable in that state, because it's a better, I guess, container for recyclability in some aspects, but it's not always the best in every case. So there's no one size fit all. I think that's the biggest thing with eco-modulation. It's really just a buzzword and basically saying you think better about how your products are packaged or how your packaging is actually formatted for the products you're choosing. So there is different solutions for different aspects of the food and beverage industry that is to keep in mind.
and
Just
Doug,
in my mind.
Ethan gave a great overview of that because it is this buzzword that gets thrown around. And I'm always
Mhm.
looking at it from the policy perspective. And just historically speaking, eco-modulation is a rather new concept. So when programs around the world, since really starting in Germany in 1990, it was really you're just paying a fee based on the type of material and the weight volume of product going into the market that has an EPR program. And policymakers in other jurisdictions, other countries were seeing, well, okay, it's not really shifting the change in packaging formats, materials, multi-layer to monolayer. So eco-modulation started up as sort of that stick, if you will, to poke them to try to encourage, more direct implementation of packaging changes. I think it's still relatively new. I think there's not a lot of data in my understanding to say is eco-modulation actually doing what it's designed to do. There are indications it is, but I think we'll have to wait and see. But definitely, I think all of the 7 laws require the producer responsibility organization to contemplate eco-modulation at some level. Some states are taking a more aggressive approach than others, but time will tell if it actually does what everyone hopes it will do.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think Ethan at one point, or Dan, maybe it was you, somebody mentioned the notion of a national EPR.
Yeah.
And to me, that at this stage of the game, that's terrifying because every state is so different in the way that they're approaching things, what their capabilities are. And so, as I think Ethan, you mentioned, there is no one size fits all solution out there. So it really does take some due diligence to figure out what the best path is for any given company operating in different EPR states. Um, you know, uh, I would encourage our attendees to submit questions. I think really one of the great opportunities here is to really get kind of conversational about some of these topics. And so if you have something that you specifically would like addressed by this group, please take advantage of the Q&A function, and we will address some of those soon here in just a little bit. Um, you know, when we do look at some of the states, and this is a bit of a question of my own to kind of get things rolling. When we look at some of the states that have implemented these strategies, the earlier states who adopted EPR legislation have had some time to settle into their programs. Are there any states that you feel have set up their program in a very kind of clear cut and industry friendly manner? Are there any states that you think provide good examples for how EPR legislation can be implemented? Any perspectives on where we could be looking for our inspiration?
Yeah, complicated question, and my answer might be a little different than someone else might say, but my perspective, I just give a quick thoughts is most people generally would agree that Maine is not true extended producer responsibility. Maybe a little bit better after the Fix-It law was enacted this year, but really didn't give a lot of producers a strong voice in the process, and really largely just shifting who's paying for the things that exist today from municipalities and consumers off to producers without a lot of strong producer involvement in that. Again, that's shifting a little bit in Maine, but I would say Oregon, flip side, second state enacted, spent about 2.5 years, Doug, before they even enacted the law to have a recycling council come together, talk about what they wanted to try to solve. Some may say the Oregon law is extremely bureaucratic. I don't remember, it was 100 plus pages, I think, when it was enacted. But for that, I think it's a more thoughtful program, even with all the bureaucracy around it. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, the last 3 states to enact, which is Minnesota, Maryland, and Washington State, have taken a little bit more producer-friendly approach. None of these laws are perfect. No one's ever going to win on everything, whether it be the industry or policymakers or environmental organizations. But it does have less stringent requirements laid out in the statute, which I think is better, so the producers in the state and other organizations can work together to recognize the uniqueness of of things in that given state. There is some skin in the game for municipalities in those three states. Producers will fund ultimately 90% of the system, which leaves another 10% for others to pay, which I think is good. Those stakeholders will have some skin in the game, and a little bit less Christmas tree effect is what I call it. So that's where you've got a bill passing, and you attach a bunch of things to it which might not be core to the given issue of extended producer responsibility. Examples of that might be reductions in toxics, specific labeling requirements, and the most recent three states have gotten a little bit better about recognizing that, yeah, industry should be looking at these things and looking at, as Ethan suggested, around those things around eco-modulation, but don't force those requirements on everyone, until it's clearly understood what the problem is. It needs to be solved in that given state.
Ethan, any
Yeah,
perspectives on this from your side?
yeah, when I was thinking of your question of clear cut and then also good for producers or beneficial to producers and understanding, I was like, oh man, some of these I feel like they're opposites in that way. Now, the clear cut ones aren't always the ones that are simplest to understand. I would agree that Oregon is probably the most bureaucratic in a good way of getting the most information. So I would say that it seems to be one of the most clear cut ones that I've seen in response with clients, but also I've seen multiple clients quite focused on Oregon's EPR and saying that this is very confusing. There is a lot of clear cut information, but it still is a lot to take in. And especially when it's all laid out like that with Oregon, it can be a lot to digest. The other aspect that's important here is unlike other areas in sustainability reporting, uh, the EPR feels like new to a lot of people, and there's constantly changes and adaptations. I mean, even looking at Oregon's reporting next year of not requiring another supply data submission, but using 2024's is not consistent across all the states. So having that understanding of what is due and what's not due, the changes that come into play, I foresee all of these states becoming more clear cut and easier for producers over time, as there definitely no, I guess, holds on changes. There, every state is willing to make changes where necessary and learn from one another. So Oregon taking that first step and putting everything out there kind of was like the scapegoat in a way for a lot of people's frustrations, and that other states took account of that and made changes or are making changes to account for what is better. And same with Oregon as well. And going forward, I think everyone was kind of worried at some point of like, for those if you didn't register with the PRO in Oregon or California or Colorado, what would that look like if you are fined a penalty? What does that process look like? And we were fortunate enough to start seeing some of that process with the CAA and a warning letter coming out of like, hey, we think you're responsible for this information that you haven't submitted. Can you let us know where you are in that process? That kind of communication and understanding will only further in the next couple of years, and especially next couple of months, to all the industries. So we'll probably see a lot of changes to make them more clear cut and more friendly to producers in a myriad of ways.
Hmm. Yeah, you mentioned Circular Action Alliance again, and we do have some
Mhm.
questions coming in from our attendees today. And one is directly related to the producer responsibility organizations involved here, and most notably Circular Action Alliance. Can you talk a little bit more about how the PROs fit into this picture? What's their role in the process? And is there a PRO in every state that has enacted EPR legislation? Is it always Circular Action Alliance? Can you provide a little bit more clarity on that point?
Yeah, I'll start, and then Ethan, I'm sure will have some thoughts as well. But Doug, all the state laws require that a producer responsibility organization, or maybe called a stewardship organization, that's the case in Maine, exist in short, think of it as a nonprofit organization that will take in the funds from the producers, the obligated producers, and then dole out those funds to those municipalities and service providers who are covered under the law. So in that responsibility, Circular Action Alliance has to develop a program plan within each state. Each state does have its, while Circular Action Alliance hasn't been formally named in each state, they essentially are the only game in town right now. Part of that is, there's a couple of reasons for that, is there are other stakeholders. For instance, Oregon allowed right out of the gate multiple pros to exist. A couple other entities did put their hat in the ring and then pulled themselves out. Some of the laws, most of the laws actually say one pro to begin with. And then after 3, 4, 5 years, some of the states will allow other pros to come online and maybe products or material specific pros. But most of the laws say one to begin with. And CAA has emerged as the one. I think it makes sense. I know people have concerns if someone doesn't like something CAA is doing, there's no other game in town to go to. But we do believe, it will create some uniformity as one organization has that insight into what's going on in all 7 states and future states to come. Yeah, Ethan, I'm sure you have a perspective as well on this.
I would say, yeah, everything you're saying, Dan, I agree with. It's very confusing at first, but when you look at EPR laws across the globe, this is kind of gives an insight into how they'll eventually work. For now, every state does require a PRO, and oftentimes that selection process is confusing for some clients. So when they say that there's a date that the PRO must be selected or registered, that's not the producer side, that's the CAA side or the PRO side. It's kind of more like a snowball effect, I would describe it as these states kind of select their first PRO, or it's like Oregon, allow multiple PROs to submit. They look for uniformity and clear understanding. So as CAA goes towards these other states and gets selected again and again, it is more likely that CAA will be selected for further states as a PRO. So you'll usually see the same kind of material categories as they try to unify the data requirements, as there is some differences in what's covered and not covered, but at least some of the names of the materials are quite similar. The aspect that it's might be different with the different PROs is important to note as well. I think there is a PRO registered with Oregon that is not for the food and beverage industry, it's for the automotive industry, but their fee schedule functions quite differently than CAA's. So there's actually a lot of differences that can occur when you have multiple PROs to select from, and it can get kind of more confusing when you're trying to figure out, okay, who do I actually go with, and how do I communicate to the other one that I went with this one? How does that work in that aspect? All that confusion is mostly why states want to keep to a minimum by having just one PRO selected, but that still is a process for some like Maine and so forth in Washington. I believe it's just an ongoing change. You'll see in the beginning of the next year some more PRO states select CAA as their PRO, and it also streamlines the producer, I guess, support that you can email as well. So it can feel like a little bit of a narrow path that you have to work with CAA, but at this point, it's more beneficial than detrimental for most producers, as it kind of streamlines the already confusing network of information you have to account for.
Yeah, any way that we can make things less confusing in this topic is obviously greatly appreciated. And, one of the questions that I hear quite often is, okay, who's going to be paying for this? We've got multiple different types of companies involved within the development of any given piece of packaging. We had a question directly related to, who is going to be paying these materials for EPR? How will it be managed and audited? I mean, is it going down to the converter level, the company that's actually creating the packaging? Is it the brand owner? Is it somebody else involved in the process? So, is there any clarity in terms of where the responsibility ultimately lies?
Yeah, there's a statutorily speaking in the laws is generally a hierarchy, Doug. And if you think of the brand owner, the person who's putting their name on the product that has the packaging is first and foremost going to likely be the producer in this instance. But in that hierarchy allowed for, and I believe all the state laws is if it's not the brand owner, then it might be the brand licensee or trademarked entity that may be the responsible party for that. If not that person, it may be the first person who imports or distributes the covered packaging into the given state, recognizing that the distribution market plays an important factor here as well. Two or three of the states also specifically address e-commerce. So they sort of bifurcate their producer responsibility definitions to discuss brick and mortar sales within a given state versus those products that might come into the state through e-commerce. But generally speaking, it's going to be the brand owner. It may be through contractual agreements that the brand owner may agree with their supplier, their converter, to take on some responsibility. Again, that would be an agreement between those two entities. But it even with all that said, it can get complicated pretty quickly, particularly when you're talking about distribution. But generally speaking, converters would not be an obligated party in most instances unless they also have their own brand out on the market. One other quick exception or addition I would say is California has, and we haven't really talked a whole lot about California specifically, but there's some many different unique requirements around plastics in the California law. One of those is an additional fund called a Plastics Pollution Mitigation Fund. It's 500 million from the producers to the state for the state to do a whole bunch of other things essentially outside extended producer responsibility. In that instance, the law does allow for the pro to potentially go to the resin manufacturers to see if they can help fund that $500 million. It doesn't require it, but it does. The statute does give the ability for the resin manufacturers to help the pro with that. So again, sort of a long answer because there isn't really a single answer depending on how producer is defined in each state.
Mhm. Yeah. I would also say, oftentimes this question is posed to us from our clients, an understanding of like, do we actually have to deal with any of this, or can we just ignore it? The aspect that I do want to have you keep in mind, no matter what perspective you're coming from, if you don't have to pay the fees, doesn't mean you shouldn't record the data. A lot of the times when we're working with clients, we're working on both sides, like I've mentioned before, the requesting the data from their suppliers or getting I guess, submitting that data to someone who's requesting it. These requests can help benefit your client, intercompany relations, and also exterior, like company to company, business to business relations as well. As if you're not responsible for the information, doesn't mean someone or a company you don't know that's you tied with yours isn't responsible for that information. So collecting the data nonetheless is beneficial, not only to stand out as a supplier, but also or manufacturer, but also to safeguard yourself just in case something changes and you are requested for that information. It's always good to assess your current data structure and gather that information nonetheless, whether you're paying for it or not.
Yeah, that's a good point, Ethan. Some companies could absolutely be ahead of the game here and already aligned with directives that are being outlined within EPR, but that doesn't mean you can just, rest on your laurels. You need to have the ability to defend that position, to be able to prove that you are aligned and that your data fits the picture. Um, you know, for some people, it's an incremental question. Some companies might be already ahead of the game and they have a truly circular packaging option in place and they feel confident about their path forward. Other companies are going to be reluctant to make the investment wholesale into a brand new packaging format, which often, so not always, but sometimes will require an investment in new equipment and so forth. It gets costly. So other companies will be looking at incremental options to reduce the impact of EPR fees for now. And we did have a question related to reduction. So when you think back on the first time the water bottles made the change in reducing the material, it was clearly audible. You could feel that those water bottles and then the sound that they made. They're doing it all in the name of reducing plastic usage, but also reducing their cost. Anytime you're reducing the amount of material that you're using, you're impacting your bottom line. But how is this being calculated for within EPR? Will there be benefits related to reduction of material when you think about the thickness of the material types, overall reduction of the physical package size, for instance? Is there a metric that is being applied to try and ease people down the road here? You think about material to volume ratios and is there anything that's being considered along these lines within EPR today?
That's a good question. I would say I can take a first step at it, and Dan, if you want to follow up with specifics. The reducing of material total weight is usually the focus here at this moment. And that's generalized, not just to apply to the food and beverage industry, but to apply to every industry. And that's the purpose of they using that metric. The idea of using material to volume ratios and improving that can get a little complex, especially if you're taking into account how much extra space is needed when filling the packaging with the product in some cases in the food and beverage industry. So the focus is as now is usually recyclability and total material weight, and also just choice. So if you're choosing a PET bottle that is clear, usually those are more recyclable. But if you have a less weight of that bottle, that also helps in that case. The specifics of the food and beverage industry and the additions that can be made or reductions that can be made, they're specific to the type of products that are packaging that is produced. That's where getting into, I guess, more detail and what's covered and not covered in eco-modulation can come into play. The problem is we're right now facing packaging laws that cover all these industries at once. So you're not going to see specifics like that in conversation until most likely a later date. But I think there's definitely room for conversation of how that would reduce and create exemptions and reductions in fees through the legal modulation process through the different PROs per state. But at this moment, I don't believe that is being considered like the material to volume ratio, more like just straight up what the material weighs in total. Dan, if you have any inputs.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key one you highlighted there, Ethan, is eco-modulation, right? And if that's going to be driving, as the producer responsibility organization has different requirements in state, whether eco-modulation or others, to establish goals on, if they're not stated in statute, in some states they are, Oregon as an example, and definitely California is, Minnesota too, where, you need to meet some requirements, or the pro needs to develop requirements around recycled content use, for example, around recycling, recyclability, compostability, reusability, right? So some percentage, 75, 100% of all cover materials packaging coming into the market needs to be compostable, reusable, or recyclable by date certain. Add on top of that potential requirement in some states that you also need to meet recycling rates. So it's one thing to say it's recyclable, but then is it actually being recycled? And California and Oregon around plastics have specific requirements about needing to meet recyclability rates by date certain. And the one other thing I'll add to that, Doug, is indicated a little bit earlier, alluded to it as a source reduction requirement in California. That's a very specific requirement to source reduce by 25%. Again, I think by 2032. But what does that mean exactly? With source reduction, there's a formula above my pay grade a little bit to be able to, source reduce either components of packaging or the actual use of plastics, for example. You can also meet source reduction requirement in California to some extent by using recycled content. And you can also meet it, or required actually, to meet some of that across all the producers in California through reuse and refill. So, and that's another way to sort of get to that talking about how much volume of packaging is on the market, and does it come in one time and then it sits in the market for a long time being reused, refilled, or is it single-use plastic packaging, which is sort of a term we hear, not well defined. But those are some of the things to be thinking about, whether it's a producer comes up with those requirements or it's mandated in statute, for instance, in California.
Yeah, you touch on a good point there, Dan. And this is something that we hear a lot about in our media brands. There's the idea of recyclability. It can be figuratively recyclable, but is it actually getting recycled? And if it is recycled, is there a use for that recycled material? Which is a key consideration here. So I think there are going to be a lot of folks who are, taking a hard look at the source materials that they're using to make sure that they fit into that picture. One point that we haven't really talked about much, I mean, when we look at Europe, Europe has some very structured EPR that's been going into action. Are we finding any inspiration from Europe in terms of the pathway for EPR that they're taking and what we could learn from them? But also, from a materials perspective, I mean, are we seeing a higher level of innovation coming from Europe, or is the innovation really coming from all over at this point? Everybody sees the writing on the wall. They know that their customers, the brand owners, are going to need to find solutions that fit within EPR, or at least minimize the impact of EPR. So, what can we learn from Europe in this process?
Yeah, I'll give a couple quick thoughts. I mean, I think I always want to remind people that while the programs in Europe and then spread through, Canada over the last 30 years were implemented, developed around the market and the ton, if you will, at that time, right? That ton has shifted dramatically in those 30 years. So I always want to put a caveat that Europe, Canada, South America, if they even do have a program in place, Doug, they are still going back and reviewing, refreshing, lessons learned on how to make those programs better. So, while I don't, and even if you look north towards Canada, some of those programs have changed because they haven't been successful, and they're even looking at making changes to them because they haven't done what they had hoped to do. I mean, from my perspective, looking particularly at Europe and some of the things happening in Europe, I'm more excited about lessons learned on sort of beyond the EPR program, the primary core of that function, but how it is helping industry innovate on the collection side, right? And infrastructure on that side, particularly for films and flexible. We see some nice things happening. If you look at CFlex, if you look at the UK program, and some nice things happening, because you hit the nail on the head, and circularity needs to mean there needs to be a market, or if you want to say responsible end market at the end of the day, or it's not truly recyclable if it doesn't have that circular path. And that's where I see some encouraging things happening in Europe and elsewhere, where we will have some good lessons learned on what those countries and other parts of the world are doing to make it truly circular as they're responding to those extended producer responsibility programs that are already in place.
Ethan, any thoughts there?
I would say it's different. I guess going from European country to European country, some handle EPRs a lot. I guess extended producer responsibility with their programs a bit differently than how it does in the US. I think the biggest lesson learned there is how uniformed the CAA is trying to make state to state. That is not always the case otherwise. I mean, there is definitely lessons learned in aspects, and I would say the innovations coming out of specific EPR programs, whether it's in Germany or it's other European countries, is pretty innovative. And you can see it kind of trickle down the future of what is wanted in the aspect of recyclability. It's very quite common in Germany, if you've ever been, to take, and when you buy a bottle of Coca-Cola, you get a charge on it that is where you have to actually recycle the bottle. So you'll see and people actually going through parks and collecting empty bottles and then putting them through the recycling machine to get some of that money back to the consumer, but also incentivize the actual recyclable ability of the products. the biggest problem in the US right now when it comes to recycling, and that true reason why we're doing all this is to create more recycling to actually happen in the US, is the contamination parts of it. So back in some universities that deal with this struggle, I know Ohio State is focusing on this as well, is that these recycling bins all over campus get all this kind of stuff thrown into it, and it contaminates the actual bin. So once it reaches a certain level of contamination, it gets impossible to actually separate the food waste from the actual food packaging there. So on aspects on the customer side or the client side, there's innovations on the actual like materials, like what Dan was saying, but there's also innovations from these European countries we can learn on the actual recyclable process. The problem with recycling is the producer responsibility extends kind of outside of it as well. The whole product doesn't care who's responsible. It will go from the manufacturer all the way to the end consumer. So lessons learned from that entire process are key here, and comparing the European countries to the US countries. But again, like Dan's saying, they're still evolving. They're changing all the time as well. So it's all like a moving point. Nothing EPR related is stuck in stone anywhere. Everything's always evolving and shifting here, and lessons are learned one way or the other. I'm sure there's European EPR laws will adjust as they see the US EPR laws advance, and we'll see adjustments going back and forth as well.
Yeah, the implementation of more advanced recycling within this country. I mean, I've seen some of the European advanced recycling facilities, and it's really amazing to see the level that they've been able to accomplish. And be looking forward to hopefully seeing some of the EPR funds that are collected to help build out some of that infrastructure. So that we can become more actionable, with all pieces of the puzzle here. Dan, I know earlier on you mentioned some of the states that and the various stages that they are within EPR implementation. We did have one final question that came through. Who else is getting into this game? Where else would we expect to see EPR implemented within the next year or so? Are there other states that are close to passing this legislation?
Yeah, great question, Doug. And I always like to say, people have heard me say, ask me that question yesterday, ask me today, and ask me tomorrow, and I may well have a different answer for you each time. But listen, we do definitely anticipate, and I'd say in the next 2 years, maybe we may have two or three more states come online, which will get this up to about 10. I think everyone should be paying very close attention to New York. We are and deeply engaged in there with a whole host of other stakeholders. But once again, the bills failed to get the consideration to get done this year in New York. But I think it's going to happen at some point in New York. I mentioned New Jersey very early on in this webinar. Is New Jersey's kicking the tires really hard on it. So I think we can expect ongoing conversation in New Jersey. And I would say my view is, if the scales tip on New York as an example, I see the very real possibility some other Northeast states will fall as well. Maybe that's not the right word to use, but whether it be New Jersey, Connecticut continues to look at it, Massachusetts, ongoing conversation there, Vermont, the conversation we expect will pick up again there. So, stay tuned on all that. Illinois is in the process of a needs assessment, sort of the approach Maryland also took before Maryland enacted as law. I don't know that this next year it will happen in Illinois, but there's another 6, 7, 8 states that are kicking the tires, and they're not all blue or purple states either, right? So that's my best guess at this point, but stay tuned.
Yeah, well, great forward thinking there as we're immersed in this issue. Well, that is about all the time that we have today. I'd like to thank our speakers, Dan Felton from Flexible Packaging Association and Ethan Redden from BSI. Your contributions today have been wonderful and really essential to this discussion. Compliance requires early planning and cross-functional alignment. Eco-modulation and smarter data can create real competitive advantages. As we go through this process, we're going to be learning from each other. We're going to be learning from what other states are doing, what other industries even are doing when it comes to EPR. So, this is going to be a long process here, but something that we need to be paying attention to today, not tomorrow. This webinar will be available on demand, so there will be an email that's sent out with a link to the on-demand version of the webinar. FPSA is always offering up new webinars to try and help businesses with the challenges that they're facing. So our next webinar at FPSA will be next Wednesday, October 22 at 11:30 a.m. Eastern, for a members-only webinar on closing the gap related to workforce trends and solutions for food equipment manufacturers. Thanks again for joining us today. This has been a great pleasure, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you.